The Strait of Hormuz has been shut for over 2 months. 20% of the world's seaborne oil gone. Gas prices up more than $1 per gallon across America. Brent crude briefly piercing $95 a barrel. The International Energy Agency calling it the largest supply disruption in the recorded history of global oil markets. And in the middle of that historic economic hemorrhage, the President of the United States flew to Beijing. What came out of that room did not make the front page, but it may have just redrawn the map of global power. Here is what everyone is missing. What happened in Beijing on May 14th was not a trade summit. It was not a conversation about semiconductors or Taiwan, though those topics filled the headlines. The single most consequential outcome of the Trump-Xi meeting was a quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable signal aimed directly at Tehran. And Iran, which has spent 3 decades constructing an ironclad geopolitical insurance policy around its relationships with Russia and China, may have just watched that policy begin to collapse in real time. Let us be precise about what actually occurred. According to the official White House readout, both presidents agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of global energy. Both agreed that Iran cannot be permitted to acquire a nuclear weapon. Xi Jinping publicly opposed the militarization of the strait. He publicly opposed any Iranian tolling system, any scheme requiring ships to obtain clearance from IRGC forces before transiting. And then came the statement that should have stopped every financial analyst and foreign policy strategist in their tracks. Xi expressed direct interest in purchasing more American oil. Specifically, he said, to reduce China's long-term dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. Read that again carefully. The single largest buyer of Iranian oil on the planet just told the United States it wants to buy American oil instead. That is not a trade deal, that is a civilizational pivot. Donald Trump, speaking to Fox News from Beijing, confirmed that Xi had told him China would not provide military equipment to Iran. Trump called it a big statement. He was right to, because when you layer that commitment on top of everything else, the public opposition to strait militarization, the joint nuclear declaration, the explicit interest in Texas and Alaskan crude, what you are watching is Beijing carefully, deliberately, and very publicly beginning to create distance from Tehran. Not severing the relationship, but fraying it, strategically, on the largest stage in the world. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to understand what China has meant to Iran's survival. Iran exports roughly 1.38 million barrels of oil per day to Chinese buyers. That figure comes from Kpler, a trade intelligence firm that tracks actual tanker movements. China's official customs data, by contrast, shows 0 imports from Iran since 2023. And that discrepancy alone tells you everything about how this particular game has been played. Those barrels move through ghost ships, through ship-to-ship transfers executed near Malaysia and Indonesia, relabeled as Malaysian crude, sometimes Omani, sometimes Indonesian. The entire architecture of Iran's sanctions evasion has run straight through Beijing's willingness to look the other way. And for years, Beijing did look the other way, because cheap, heavily discounted Iranian oil kept Chinese refineries profitable and humming. But here is what has changed. The Strait of Hormuz closure, the very weapon Iran deployed to punish Washington and Jerusalem, has turned on China with devastating precision. Half of China's total crude oil imports and nearly 1/3 of its liquefied natural gas used to move through that waterway. That is not an inconvenience. That is an existential energy security crisis for the world's largest economy. China held strategic stockpiles, approximately 1.39 billion barrels in storage as of early March, roughly 120 days of net imports. But that clock is not paused. It is ticking, and Iran, the nation that triggered this closure in the first place, has become the source of China's pain every bit as much as America's. This is where the entire leverage calculation flips. For years, the conventional wisdom held that China was untouchable as a pressure point against Tehran. Beijing bought the oil. Beijing provided the economic oxygen that kept Iran breathing under sanctions. Beijing shielded Iran diplomatically at the United Nations Security Council. The assumption in Washington was that China could never be converted into a genuine instrument of pressure on the Iranian regime. That assumption may now be obsolete, because for the first time, China has a direct, economically devastating, strategically urgent reason to want Iran to stand down. Every day the strait remains closed, China bleeds, and Beijing just told the world in front of every camera on the planet that it agrees the strait must reopen. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made this point with almost surgical clarity on Thursday. Speaking to CNBC, he stated that China has a significantly larger interest in reopening the strait than the United States does, and that China would work behind the scenes to whatever extent any external actor holds influence over Iranian leadership. Then he dropped something harder. Iran's primary oil export terminal at Karg Island has had 0 tanker loadings for days. The US naval blockade is holding. Iran's storage tanks are at capacity. Satellite imagery, Bessent said, shows Iran beginning to physically shut down production because there is nowhere left to put the oil. No ships entering, no ships departing. Iran's oil economy is not merely hurting, it is beginning to seize. And when China publicly aligns with the United States on keeping the strait open and signals interest in rerouting its energy purchases to American production, Iran loses the single argument that gave it negotiating power over the entire world. The argument was simple: you need us. The oil flows through us. We can make this painful for everyone. But now Beijing is telling the world it is actively looking to replace that dependency. Trump confirmed that Chinese tankers would begin arriving at the ports of Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska. The United States plans to ramp up oil and LNG exports, specifically calibrated to fill the supply void that China needs addressed. Now, intellectual honesty demands a caveat here. China has not abandoned Iran. Not yet. The Chinese government's own official readout of the Beijing meeting did not mention Iran directly. Not once. That omission is deliberate. It tells you precisely how Beijing is calibrating this move. Public enough to send an unmistakable signal, private enough to maintain options. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when asked whether Trump had directly requested China's help with Iran, was almost theatrical in his deflection. He stated that no request was made, that Washington does not need Beijing's help. Both men said this with straight faces, in a room where everyone present understood it was diplomatic theater. Because of course China's involvement matters. Of course it was discussed. That is why Air Force One flew to Beijing. The signal sent to Tehran is nonetheless unmistakable. Iran has invested 3 decades in the belief that its alliances with Russia and China would insulate it from any version of maximum pressure that Washington could construct. Russia is now consumed by Ukraine, its military capacity and diplomatic bandwidth stretched to the breaking point. And now China has stood beside America's president and agreed publicly, on camera, in front of the world, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon and that the strait must remain open. The 2 foundational pillars of Iran's geopolitical insurance policy have cracked simultaneously. And while Trump and Xi were shaking hands, Iran was making its own moves. At the very moment the summit was unfolding in Beijing, a vessel was seized near the Strait of Hormuz and moved toward Iranian waters. A separate Indian-flagged cargo ship sank off the coast of Oman following an attack. In the days preceding the summit, the IRGC had been conducting military exercises, internally designated the Martyr Commander drills, focused specifically on expanding Iran's capacity to dominate the strait through asymmetric means: drones, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, sea mines, GPS jamming systems. The objective is not to defeat the United States Navy in open battle. The IRGC is not built for that, and its commanders know it. The strategy is different and more sophisticated. It is to make the strait so dangerous, so commercially prohibitive, that no shipping company will dispatch a vessel through it, regardless of what any navy says or does. This has been their doctrine from the beginning. War risk insurance for Hormuz transits was effectively withdrawn almost immediately after the conflict escalated in late February. Protection and indemnity coverage, the critical insurance layer that enables commercial vessels to operate, became economically impossible to secure. And that alone, without a kinetic strike on every ship, was sufficient to collapse traffic through the world's most critical energy corridor. The IRGC grasped something that conventional military analysts often underestimate. The economic weapon is more powerful than the military one. Make the insurance unaffordable. Make ship owners unwilling to expose their assets. Achieve a de facto closure through commercial paralysis rather than direct military blockade. That doctrine has been working. Even after a ceasefire was announced on April 8th, shipping traffic through the strait remained far below pre-war levels. But now comes a form of pressure Iran never fully anticipated in this configuration. China, publicly on the world stage, with every major news network broadcasting, declared its opposition to the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz and to any effort to impose a transit toll on shipping. Iran had been floating the concept of something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a new Iranian bureaucratic body that would require vessels to obtain clearance from IRGC forces before passing through. A stranglehold dressed in administrative language, a toll system in everything but name. Xi Jinping just told Donald Trump in front of the planet that China opposes exactly that. For the IRGC, the faction that has spent this entire conflict consolidating internal political power within the Iranian system, this is a strategic catastrophe. The Revolutionary Guard has been the primary force behind the strait closure. It is the entity that derives the greatest institutional benefit from Iran's leverage over global shipping lanes. It is also the entity most viscerally resistant to any peace arrangement that dismantles that leverage. Because once the strait reopens, once Iran formally stands down, once a nuclear agreement is signed with real verification mechanisms, the IRGC loses the greatest source of its power and its identity. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was built on resistance. It does not want to be defanged. And a Washington-Beijing alignment explicitly targeting Iranian militarization of the strait is precisely the configuration that threatens to defang it. Which is why internal Iranian politics in the coming weeks matter as much as the diplomatic negotiations themselves. Iran's government is not a monolith. There are factions prepared to negotiate, factions that see the strategic writing on the wall. And there are factions that would rather burn the strait than surrender an inch of leverage. The pattern is visible in the timing. The day Trump met Xi, a ship was seized. The day Rubio stated that ceasefire talks were progressing, new strikes occurred near the Lebanese border. These are not coincidences. These are messages sent from inside Iran by the faction that does not want peace, and certainly does not want China to help deliver it. Now bring this back to what it means for ordinary people, for American markets, for household finances, for the global economy absorbing this historic shock. The IMF warned last month that if the conflict drags on and elevated oil prices persist, global growth could fall to 2.5%, their adverse scenario. Gas prices in the United States have risen more than $1 per gallon since February. Airlines are passing fuel costs to passengers in the form of surcharges and fees. Amazon, FedEx, and the US Postal Service have all implemented fuel surcharges. Food prices are under mounting pressure because fertilizer, largely exported through the Gulf, has become scarce. Over 30% of global urea, which is essential to the cultivation of corn and wheat, transits the Strait of Hormuz. When that lane closes, it is not only oil that stops moving, it is food security. It is the supply chain for the world's staple crops. If the Beijing summit accelerates a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, if China genuinely leans on Tehran, if the strait reopens even partially, Brent crude could fall $15 to $20 per barrel within weeks. That would represent one of the most consequential deflationary events for the US economy in years. Lower oil, lower gas prices, lower food costs, lower headline inflation, more room for the Federal Reserve to maneuver on monetary policy. Equity markets would surge on the news. But if the IRGC chooses escalation, if the hardliners double down, if the strait is mined again, if a tanker is struck in a way that cannot be dismissed as a minor skirmish, then oil moves back toward $100 per barrel, and the economic damage deepens across every sector. Understand the full architecture of what is being constructed here. Just days before the Beijing summit, the US Treasury Department sanctioned 12 entities specifically for facilitating Iranian oil sales to Chinese buyers. That is pressure applied from multiple directions simultaneously. Every ghost tanker hit with sanctions makes it harder, riskier, and more expensive for Chinese refineries to continue purchasing Tehran's crude at any price. Military blockade of Iranian export terminals. Sanctions on the shadow fleet that moves Iranian oil. A joint statement with China that the strait must remain open and Iran cannot go nuclear. And a direct commercial incentive for Beijing to redirect its energy purchases to American production, with the President of the United States personally inviting Chinese tankers to the ports of Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska. This is not conventional diplomacy. This is the architecture of a new global energy order being negotiated in real time. Consider what it means for American energy production. Texas shale operations, Louisiana export terminals, Alaska's vast and largely untapped reserves. Trump is not merely managing a conflict, he is attempting to permanently redirect the most important commodity trade flow on Earth, Chinese oil demand, away from the Middle East and toward American production. If that strategy succeeds, even partially, the geopolitical and economic consequences ripple forward for decades. American energy dominance becomes structural, not situational. And China has its own compelling reasons to engage with this realignment. The Strait of Hormuz closure has exposed Beijing's most profound strategic vulnerability: its dependence on a single maritime choke point it does not control and cannot militarily defend. Between 45 and 50% of China's crude oil imports used to move through that strait. One conflict, one flashpoint, one fleet of IRGC speedboats armed with anti-ship missiles, and China's industrial economy begins to seize. Xi Jinping has spoken extensively about energy security for years. The 2026 closure of the Strait of Hormuz proved, in the most visceral and undeniable way possible, that China's energy security is structurally fragile. Buying American oil from Alaska is not merely a trade concession, it is a hedge. It is strategic diversification. It is Beijing accepting that its economic future cannot be held hostage to the decisions of a government that does not legally own, but militarily controls, the world's most critical shipping lane. There is a brutal irony buried in all of this. Iran closed the strait to punish the United States and Israel, to make the world hurt, to force concessions, to demonstrate that its leverage was real and its willingness to use it was absolute. But in executing that strategy, Iran forced China to confront its own vulnerability in the starkest possible terms. And now China is pivoting toward American energy in a way that could permanently erode Beijing's dependence on Iranian crude. Iran may have just deployed its most powerful strategic weapon, and in doing so convinced its most important economic benefactor to begin searching for a replacement. The law of unintended consequences operating at a geopolitical scale. None of this is resolved. The strait remains largely closed. Ships continue to be seized. The IRGC continues its military exercises. Ceasefire negotiations between Washington and Tehran are grinding through a chasm of competing demands. Iran still insists on the full lifting of all sanctions before it will formally agree to nuclear limits. The United States still demands verification and real dismantlement before any sanctions relief is extended. These are not small gaps. They are fundamental disagreements about the terms of Iran's existence as a regional power. And the IRGC faction that benefits from the impasse is actively working to ensure no agreement gets signed. But something shifted this week, something fundamental and irreversible. The geometry of this conflict changed. Because for the first time since this war began, Washington and Beijing are pointing in the same direction, at Tehran, and they are doing it openly. Iran, for all its asymmetric ingenuity, for all its decades of experience navigating sanctions and isolation, has never had to face a world in which the United States and China agreed on the one thing that matters most. The real question is not whether China holds leverage over Iran. It does. Leverage that no US military strike can replicate. The real question is whether Beijing will actually use that leverage, and how hard. Xi can make phone calls that move oil markets. He can quietly convey to Iranian leadership that Chinese refineries will cease purchasing their crude if the strait remains